Some people have been asking me, is the cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Lab really dead? It's not a short answer. So the short of it is no, not completely dead, but meaningful cleanup, it's dead. If we don't get enough attention on this issue, if we don't shame Boeing enough, if we don't make the DTSC feel more uncomfortable enough, this is what we get, and it's not going to be a cleanup. So this is what Boeing does. They rename things, they shuffle the numbers, and then they say, here you go, you get a cleanup. And I'm going to show you in this long TikTok video how they've done that in the past. Ready? Here we go. Back in 2007, the first cleanup agreements were penned for Santa Susana Field Lab. And the main parties were Boeing, who owns 80% of the site, NASA, and Department of Energy. Those are the responsible parties who have to pay for the cleanup of the site. And they entered that legally binding agreement with the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or DTSC, which is an agency under EPA. In that cleanup agreement, it was a risk-based cleanup, which is incredibly common, and they're just not great cleanups. They're pretty much the only kind of cleanups most sites do, but I'm going to explain to you why that's really actually not a great thing. Part of this cleanup agreement was that they would include options to meet local zoning codes for the property all around the site, which included rural, residential, and agricultural. So the idea with a risk-based cleanup is that you will only have to clean up as much as people will be exposed to and not get cancer from it. For example, if it's a residential with garden cleanup, then it would be safe enough. They would remove so much contamination that you could hypothetically live on site, you could grow a backyard garden, you could eat that produce and not get cancer from it. That's pretty good. Same with agricultural. If they wanted to farm there, that they wouldn't get cancer from eating the produce or the livestock that they grew there. On the other side of the spectrum is a recreator cleanup. And that's the idea that hardly anyone's ever going to spend time there. They're just going to maybe hike for a few hours, maybe a few times a month, maybe a few times a year. So it doesn't have to get cleaned up very much because nobody's living there 24/7. It's faulty thinking, and I'm going to tell you why. The problem with a recreator cleanup, especially in our case, is that the Santa Susana Field Lab's contamination, it's in the soil. It's loose. It's not like buried in a vault. It's not in big barrels where they don't know where it is. It's fallout. It's loose. It looks like soil. So when the wind blows, it blows the contamination into our community, even though DTSC says it doesn't. When the Woolsey fire happened, which started at the Santa Susana Field Lab, it spread contamination. We did an independent study that found radionuclides from the Santa Susana Field Lab off-site through the ash and through the smoke. We know that Boeing has been fined over $1 million for polluting the river with contamination from the Santa Susana Field Lab. So despite Boeing and DTSC's claims that contamination doesn't come off-site, it clearly does. And that's why a risk-based cleanup, especially of a recreator cleanup, is not sufficient, because the contamination comes off-site. It's not cleaned up at the source. It will continue to migrate into the water, into the air. It harms the wildlife that live there and nearby, can pollute the groundwater. So leaving it there is just a ploy to make sure they don't have to pay for a complete cleanup. Boeing went as far as to put the land in an easement to make sure nobody ever lived there and said, look, now it's safe, but what about all of us? That's why we continue to fight for the complete cleanup of the Santa Susana Field Lab. We always say we want the safest, smartest, most comprehensive cleanup available. And for a brilliant company like Boeing, they should be capable of that, but they don't want to spend the money. So this fight goes back to Boeing trying to get out of those cleanup agreements. We saw after they signed a risk-based cleanup back in 2007, Boeing sent out letters to the community promising a suburban residential cleanup, which, wasn't perfect, but it was something. And it said that people could live there on site, hypothetically, but you couldn't grow vegetables. You couldn't really interact with the soil, but they were willing to do at least that much of a cleanup. They soon gave up on that, and they were sneaky. 2015, and here's for my science geeks, here's a little geek candy for you. They started changing the risk-based screening levels, the RIBSLs, in the cleanup documents, but they didn't tell anybody. They just quietly started changing all the numbers. So let's say, for example, the cleanup SRAM, it's called, the Standardized Risk-Based Methodology, Standardized Risk Assessment Methodology, there we go, SRAM. They started changing, like it listed PCBs, it would tell you under a residential with garden cleanup, this is how much PCB has to be cleaned up so people don't get cancer from it. And then they would show a residential suburban scenario, and then they would show a recreator scenario. It would show the numbers for each, how much of any given contamination known to be on site could a person be exposed to under that cleanup scenario and not get cancer. So in 2015, they did a little bit of magic. They took the standardized risk assessment methodology and they started changing the risk-based screening levels. And for each contaminant known to be on site, PCBs, lead, mercury, arsenic, like all the different contaminants of concern, they started moving all the numbers around. So before it would say for a specific contaminant of concern, how much could exist and be left there after residential with garden cleanup and not cause cancer for people. And then in the next column, it would be a suburban residential and how much contamination could be left there and not cause cancer. And then a recreational cleanup, how much. It's based again on exposure levels. All of a sudden, we started seeing 96 out of 100 people could get cancer with the residential with garden cleanup. People found out, they went nuts. Boeing took that away, said our mistake. But then they tried to change it again in the settlement agreement in 2022. This time, that agreement was done behind closed doors. Residents were not given the opportunity to fight back, which is why we are suing the DTSC right now over a CEQA violation lawsuit. Today, when people ask, is the cleanup dead? They did it again. They took the numbers in the SRAM and they started messing with the risk-based projections of how much cancer you could get. And now the numbers in the residential with garden scenario, they look very similar to the recreator scenario. They have moved the numbers around, that it's still residential with garden cleanup. So our funeral, we're getting back finally to the point, our funeral will be for the residential with garden cleanup scenario, because right now it's been killed. Boeing has killed it, they buried it, and it is dead. So they might tell us that we are getting a cleanup. It is not a complete cleanup. And this is meant to shame Boeing, to let them know we are on to them.